again. Thank you so much for joining us at Virtual Shakeup 3.0. I am so delighted to introduce Tonya Rees, who is the Executive Director of Intellectual Property at Edelman. Tonya is, this is going to be a special treat for us. She is actually going to present Edelman's Trust Barometer, which I believe is in its 21st year. Correct, Tonya?
That's right. 21 years of studying trust.
And this is really important for everybody. I think the results are going to be very revealing about what we as businesses need to do in the future. But this is a huge session with tons of information. So I'm going to hand it over to Tonya right now.
Great. Thank you, Heather. So good to be here, everyone. As Heather mentioned, Edelman has been studying trust for over 20 years now. We primarily look at trust in institutions. But this is really has been an extraordinary year, a year that has tested trust like no other. And I personally believe that the events industry has a pretty big role to play in helping us restore trust. And we'll talk about that as we go through. I have a lot of material, so I hope you have your coffee ready. I'm going to be going pretty quickly because I'd like to make sure that we have time for questions. And we will be sharing the slides afterwards. So if there's any data that you'll want to come back to, please ask during the questions, or we can follow up after the session as well. Okay, let's get going. Most of the results you're going to see today are from the US version of the Trust Barometer, but it is a global study fielded this year in 28 countries. Most of the data here was collected in October and November of last year, but you'll also see the results from the post-election flash poll that we did in December in the US. And then just last week, we released another flash poll focusing on trust and the pandemic, sort of marking the one-year anniversary of the pandemic. So you'll see different data points, and I'll be sure to call those out as we go through. Big theme this year, every year we kind of have a title and a focus for the report. And this year, in addition to tracking a pandemic, we also we'll be talking about what we call an infodemic. It has just become so difficult for people to find a shared understanding of the truth. There's a loss of trust in media, a loss of trust in information sources. It's time to declare bankruptcy and start over. So you'll see a lot of information about that as we go through this. But first, let's look at this year. Truly, trust has been put to the test like never before. What we saw over the course of 2020 is that at the height of the pandemic in May, shortly after we went into lockdown, we conducted a special report and found that there was actually a surge in trust as people were turning to institutions for help. But then, as you can see in the fall, that trust almost entirely evaporated. And the biggest trust decline in the fall was government. We're showing that by country there on the right-hand side. In the US, government trust dropped 6 points in the fall. As you can see globally, media and NGOs not too far behind, business the least volatile. So here's where we are here in the US, right? A surge for almost all institutions, and then a decline in November, a further decline after the election, believe it or not, when we went back into the field. And so you can see 11, 12-point drops for 3 of the institutions, less volatility for business. Interestingly, if we break out those declines here in the US, based on who people voted for, you can see primarily it was among Trump voters that we saw the biggest decline. Rather than focusing on the differences, they're called out here, big gaps in trust in media, government, NGOs. I like to focus on the things that unifies us, and what you can see here is a shared respect for business, right? Both Biden and Trump voters, 55% trust in business, and it is the most trusted institution among the Trump voters who were feeling very disenfranchised at that moment in time in December, about 4 weeks after the election. So as of January, our January report, business has a pretty special role. I know many of you here today represent the media. Business is unique among the four institutions in that it is the only one that's seen as both competent and ethical, which are the two big pillars of trust, right? Do I trust you to be able to get things done? And do I trust you to do the right thing? And so for the first time, we're seeing business move into a position where not only are they the most competent, but they're also the only ones that are both competent and ethical. NGOs are seen as ethical, but not competent. Media kind of went backwards, right? Media went in the wrong direction on competency and is below the line on ethics. And then, of course, government bringing up the rear and really holding everyone back when it comes to our ability to collaborate and get things done. A very special role for employers, right? So as you can see here around the world in all 28 of the countries that we study, employers are trusted. 72% of employees in the US say they trust the company that they work for. And we also see over the years much less volatility for employer trust. So there's a unique connection that organizations can have and a unique amount of influence they can have with their workforce to sort of build trust from the inside out, if you will. All right, but zooming back out globally, big declines this year in China. The good news was in Australia, a plus 12 increase in trust. And then you can see here the US down at the bottom. And if the December flash poll was taken into account, even further down in the bottom in that distruster, below 50% trusting their institutions puts a country into that distrust territory. So we're not in great shape in the US when it comes to trust. We're also not in terrific shape externally, how other countries view us. As you can see on the left, how much do you trust companies who are headquartered in each of these countries? The US has fallen from 62% trust American businesses down all the way this year to 48%, which puts us into distrusted territory for the first time. But you can see it really has been a year globally of distrust, with all four of the major powerhouses that we're showing here distrusted, and government, in addition to business in the US, also being distrusted abroad. So challenges for those of us who are doing global events or are multinational companies when we go into other markets. One other big headline, just looking at trust writ large, is our trust inequality. We measure an audience that we refer to as the informed public. You can see the results for them there on the left. These are people who are in the top quartile of income, so they're more affluent, they're higher educated, college educated or more. They over-index on consumption of business and public policy information. That's where the title Informed Public comes from, representing about 17% of the total audience. And you can see that if you are in that top of the pyramid, life looks pretty good, right? Your 401k is doing great, the stock market is booming, and business is terrific. That is not how the world looks for the other 85% on the right there. And you can see a double-digit gap in trust in almost every country that we measure. And that trust inequality, that sense of fairness, is part of what is really eroding a sense of shared purpose. And you can see from that little chart on the right that this has not always been the case, right? Typically, affluent people have been more trusting than everyone else, but you can see that gap has really gotten wider and it has spread to where it's now in nearly every country that we measure at double digits. Scary. Okay, so we are in a distrusting place and we are in a scary place. People are worried about all kinds of things. To me, one of the most surprising things about the findings is that the fear of COVID is actually not even the biggest fear that people have, right? So in the US, 81% concerned about job loss, right? I'm going to lose my job to automation, globalization, robots, hackers and cyber attacks. This is data that was collected before the big break-in of December. And so already people were concerned about that. Climate change, the fear of COVID, and of course, at a parallel level, the fear of losing my freedom and right, whether it's as a result of fighting COVID and taking measures or for other reasons, right? So a lot of things that people are concerned about, and the pandemic just made those things worse. When we asked people just last week, right? So this is very fresh data collected March 8. 2/3 of Americans said describe themselves as being still in a pandemic mindset, worried about their safety and operating in survival mode, as opposed to feeling a sense that the pandemic is largely behind us. And you can see that that fear is really consistent across demographics, ethnicities, genders, age groups. A little bit of polarization there. If you're a Trump supporter, you're less concerned about the pandemic. But aside from that, cross regions, still in survival mode, and not ready to go back to normal. What's interesting about this slide is that the percent of Americans who feel right now doing these things safely, right, feel that they're safe doing these things, it's only 1 in 3 once you get past doctor's offices and basic grocery shopping. And even there, only 55%, about half, say that they feel safe doing those things. Then you get to 30s, 20s. The column on the right is among the portion, it was about 20%, 15 or 20%, who had already been vaccinated when we took this survey. And you can see that vaccination alone is not necessarily conferring a sense of safety and peace of mind about resuming normal activities. So while there is hope on the horizon, and I think we're all feeling that, we're not yet ready to go back to normal when it comes to planning the return to the workplace or a return perhaps even to live events. The pandemic has also accelerated people's concerns about job loss. 6 in 10 have been exposed to job loss at their place of work. People are worried about humans being replaced with robots and AI, and that accelerating. And the pandemic is also deepening inequities, right? People with less education, fewer resources, are being burdened with more of the suffering, having to take on those essential worker roles and potentially being exposed to more of the health risk as well. So across the board, and this is US data, but this is true in almost every country we measured, huge demand that we have to address some very foundational problems. Number one, in almost every country, we have to address our healthcare system and make improvements there. Here in the US, interestingly, the concern about fake news and information quality is very, very high on the list. Protecting our individual freedoms, of course, as Americans we're concerned about. But then look at these things: our education system, poverty, the economic divide. These are really fundamental building blocks of our social order that people are saying we need to address these things. The challenge, of course, is that we can't necessarily agree on who are the right people to lead us forward, or even on what is the right information about these problems that we can use to build answers about, right? So there's a real sense of a lack of trust in societal leaders. Look at this, only 33% trust government leaders to do what is right. CEOs, journalists, even religious leaders, all in that distrust or territory. Once you get into things that are more local, trust is higher. And there's a huge difference. Case in point, look at the two bars for CEOs. One is CEOs in general, not trusted, but my employer CEO is trusted, right? So there's a lot more trust in employers, in people I know, people who are in my local community, and luckily for us, also scientists. Even though there's been a decline there, still in the trusted territory. So that sense of bringing things local, again, I'm going to sprinkle some of this throughout, but this is part of where I think about how much in-person events or even virtual events can help bring people together and give us a sense of personal relationship, and that we have more knowledge, more awareness, more familiarity, and even more participation. All of these are things that build trust. Okay, problems with leadership. We think our leaders are not telling us the truth on purpose, right? Government leaders, business leaders, purposely trying to mislead people. by saying things they know are exaggerations or untrue. We have less faith in spokespeople, right? Which of these do you rate as being credible as a source of information? Most credible, peers and academic experts, company technical experts, but you can see that we have declines this year across all types of spokespeople. Typically, people either gravitate towards peers and regular people like myself, or they might say, gee, I got burned on social media. I'm going to pay more attention to experts. This is the first year we're seeing declines in credibility for both peers and experts. But very low levels of credibility for all types of spokespeople. And that really is part of what is feeding this infodemic, which of course is making it harder for us to build trust. Look at these trend lines for news and information sources. And those of you in the media, I feel you. This is very, very hard to see traditional media dropping to a new low, only trusted by 46% of our respondents. And again, dropping below search engines and people's ability to find information for themselves. Owned media dropped as well, not quite as much. Social media is just not getting off the ground and earning trust. New lows for all types of information sources. The news is really seen as biased. This is true in the US, it's true in other countries as well. People believe that news organizations are simply too concerned with supporting an ideology rather than informing the public. They're not doing well at coming across as objective or nonpartisan, and journalists are not trusted either. So here's where we are. Employer media, right? Communications from my organization and my employer across different formats are seen as more believable than even news stories are, or information put out from the national government. So the extent to which organizations can think about, and in fact, as you'll see shortly, should think about, right, and take on as a challenge and an obligation and opportunity, really, to invest in educating and informing their workforce and beyond, right, through that workforce, informing their local community, and perhaps even thinking more broadly about that, what that opportunity looks like. But this is the first year that we're really saying that companies have to fill not only the void left by government, but to some extent the void left by the current lack of trust in media as well. People want to do their part, right? When we look at what are your personal priorities and how are those shifting, putting my family and their needs at the top of my to-do list, not surprisingly, given the year we've all been through, has increased in urgency and importance across the board. But then look at these other things that have risen to the top. Political engagement, speaking out when I see the need for changes. It's really been a year of activism, right, across so many topics, but also increasing my own personal information literacy and increasing my science literacy. I don't trust anyone else to tell me the truth, so I'm going to have to go figure out how to find it myself. The challenge, of course, is when we look at information literacy and what we call here information hygiene here in the US. Are you engaged with the news? Are you avoiding information echo chambers and checking multiple sources? Do you make sure that the news you're reading, the information you're reading is accurate and you're checking multiple sources to vet it? And do you check that information before you go out and share it? Good information hygiene, the way we define it in this scale, means you're doing 3 of these 4 things. Don't even have to get an A+. A C is good enough, and still only 22% of Americans fit that category. And even among those who say, the 52% who say they're amplifying news, only about 1 in 4 are practicing good information hygiene. So there is a lot of super spreading of not very accurate and reliable information that is happening. And this affects our ability to recover from the pandemic, right? There is a double-digit difference in people's willingness and enthusiasm about the vaccine when they have good information hygiene compared to bad. In the US, a 17-point difference. Those without good information hygiene, only 52% planning to vaccinate in the next year, while if you have good information hygiene, it's 7 in 10. So this really makes a big difference. And of course, we know that the sooner we can get past the health concerns of the pandemic, the faster we can truly open up and get back to work and back to the in-person meetings we all want to be at. And people really share that sense as well. Those who have a choice of going back to work, 6 in 10 still chose to stay at home. Why? Because of the concern about COVID. Among those who chose to go back to the office, the number one reason there, 52%, because they're more productive, right? So yes, people are going to want a new look at the workplace moving forward, maybe a more hybrid working environment that gives them some of that flexibility, the enhanced work-life balance, less time spent commuting. But we all agree also that the right office environment and workplace can also be more productive, and we all would like to get back to that when we feel safe. So, what is the role for business? And let's also, in the conversation and the time we'll have left, talk a little bit maybe about the role for events. There is a very strong expectation that business helps to play a role in solving societal issues. As you'll recall, business is about 40 or 50 points more competent than government. So please step in when the government is not fixing problems and help come up with solutions. Please take the lead on change, and please hold yourself accountable to the public, not just to your board of directors. CEOs are supposed to have a voice and be part of the chorus of voices that are talking and informing us about issues, everything from the pandemic to the future of jobs, as well as broader societal and local community issues. And this, to me, is one of the most interesting slides in the whole report this year. When we look at this year, what are the key trust drivers for business, right? When we look at trusted businesses versus untrusted and what really makes the difference, at the top of the list, guarding information quality, right? So businesses who are seen as dedicated to providing high quality information and educating the public, that is the number one most important predictor of trust. Other things are important as well, right? Your COVID response, your commitment to sustainability and long-term thinking, and of course, your doing your job of creating prosperity and jobs for everybody, right? All important things in building trust, but that guarding of information quality, that's a new thing on the to-do list for business. Very important, and I think also something for those of us who are events organizers to think about. Increasingly, there is broad agreement across demographics that both consumers but also employees should have a voice, and that those voices should be heard and they should influence the direction of brands and the direction of the employer or their organization. Right? And even consumers want to know that the employees at the companies to which they are loyal consumers have a seat at the table, right? Because that builds trust, right? If regular people have a role and a seat at the table, then I'm going to be more trusting of that organization as a whole. And we've all seen the rise of increased workplace activism. A lot of it, of course, very specific to certain industries. Walkouts at Amazon, Google, the tech industry initially, but this is really spreading to other businesses as well across industry sectors. 1 in 2 employees today say that they are more likely today than they were a year ago to speak up, voice their objections to management when they disagree, or even engage in workplace protests. So some key takeaways that we want to leave you with, and then I'm looking forward to a really good conversation. There is an expanded mandate for business to lead on all kinds of issues, whether it's sustainability to the pandemic response. Before you start messaging or talking, it's important that you've taken action. to address issues, right? And thought about how you can contribute. We know that events create a terrific platform for both action as well as demonstrating and showcasing those actions, right? So embracing that mandate, the dedication to providing trustworthy content, right? It's about leading with facts, right? Delivering straight talk, but also being human and empathetic, right? Acknowledge people's fears and concerns in order to make sure that you can be heard. All institutions have to commit themselves to providing truthful, unbiased, and reliable information across institutions, across organizations, and that can mean all kinds of things depending on where you sit. And finally, partnership, right? No one institution, no one organization can solve the problems we're facing or take us into a better future on its own. So it's very important that we find a common purpose and find a way to take collective action. So with that, that has been a lightning tour of the U.S. results for the Trust Barometer, and I'm looking forward to taking questions and talking about this data.
Tonya, thank you. Fascinating information, and I don't even know where to start with questions. But I think the biggest question I have is, how the heck did we get here? I mean, this is really disturbing. I mean, it is really frightening what this is telling us. Like, we have screwed up across media, government, like the stress levels that people are dealing with right now. I mean, this is I don't know. What are your thoughts about how this happened? And is there light at the end of the tunnel?
Yes, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. Although sometimes some tunnels are longer than others, but there is light and there is hope. How did we get here? In many ways, this has been a long time coming, right? As early as 2004, 2006, we started noting the rise of people like myself as influencers. And if you think about it, that really aligns with the changes in the media landscape, right? And the massive disruption that happened with social media, which those of us who were in the industry at the time, so many of us were so optimistic, embracing social media as a force for good. But I think we've all now seen that there's also been a lot of unintended consequences to social media. And one of those is that it truly did undermine and erode the influence of, or the sense of authority and trust in authority figures and experts, right? And it just has become too easy for people to use personal attacks to undermine confidence in experts, which then has resulted in undermining confidence in the truth. The steady drumbeat in the more recent years of fake news and journalists and the media are the enemy of the people, of course, has not helped to reestablish that confidence. And I think the media themselves have a lot of reasons to do some soul searching as to how they may have contributed to getting us here. Certainly, there are a lot of unanswered questions about the future of the media business model, and how we solve that moving forward and get back to sort of a better place with that. So I think that has really been a huge factor in this country, especially, and this predates the most recent administration. We've had a rise of polarization and partisanship that I don't think any one of our politicians should be proud of, having contributed to, because that certainly has made it harder for us to come together as a nation, to solve problems, debate, compromise, and stay focused on solution. So those two things have been big contributors. But there's also the third thing, longer term trend that I would point to, which I touched on just briefly, but we've had other reports dig into it more deeply, which is that rising inequality, right? And when you have economic inequality, social inequality, that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And when that inequality becomes, partly also because of social media, right, easier to see and has even more of a spotlight on it, It's one thing, ironically, developing nations that are far less privileged and wealthy than we are here have higher trust, right? Because trust is a forward-looking metric, and it's really my belief that my life is going to be better in the next years, right? And if my income levels are rising and, we're going from living in a poor society to middle class, that's great. I have trust in the future. But if we're already at a pretty privileged place, but I see others who are getting an unfair share of the pie, that is one of the biggest feeders of mistrust, right? When I feel like things are unfair.
Well, that actually leads me to another question, because I thought it was fascinating. We don't trust CEOs, but I trust the CEO of my business. And the first thing that popped into my mind was, okay, the CEOs that have the most visibility are like, Zuckerberg and Bezos, et cetera, of these large entities who have really profited greatly from this pandemic.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, like, how much has that impacted it? And that, you want to talk about inequality. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. One of the biggest drivers of, CEO mistrust in general, people do not think that CEOs are fairly compensated relative to the rest of us.
mm-hmm.
Right? So big questions about CEO compensation and how much money they're taking home, and is that a fair share of the pie or not? And even in this country where there's much more of a culture of you should have a chance at that golden ring. We love entrepreneurs, right? But that sense of getting something that's not your fair share is where the problems start. And then, let's be honest, CEO, it's very tricky to say. It's easy for me to say to a CEO, hey, you have to get out there and talk about societal issues. Well, guess what? Those issues can be very controversial sometimes, right? And so for a lot of CEOs, it's been very challenging finding a way to make that transition from I'm heads down focused on my business to now I need to be a societal leader as well and talk about things where my employees may not all agree on measures that we take to address some of these problems or my point of view on a problem. So how do I navigate that? It's a challenging thing to do, but I think if we look at what are the examples of CEOs who are trusted, they're the ones that have figured out how to do that right. How to have the conversation, how to be human, how to not always maybe have the answer, and how to not be afraid of saying, that's a great question. I don't know the answer, right? That simple, humble statement alone will buy you more trust than being the smartest person in the room, but it's also one of the most difficult things for a CEO to say.
Yeah, emotional intelligence on a 10x scale. So I'm going to ask I'll bring a controversial point up, because the workforce activism, like, I get it, but what I also see out there is a lot of bullying happening. And I'll just use Teen Vogue as an example, right? Like, how much is too much? Like, and how does a CEO, for example, or a company leadership team manage this? Because I think that, yes, it's one thing to listen to your employees and have them have a voice, but I think it's another to, I don't know, that Teen Vogue thing really kind of got me a little bit.
It can be a fine line, right? I think the thing to remember is that employees who are more passionate, who are more likely to speak out, also tend to be more passionate about their work, right? So if you can find that magic intersection of people who are engaged, they're passionate about issues, their work, they want their work to bring them a purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
A bigger purpose. Those are the people who are also going to work harder because they're more committed, they're more passionate, right? So just recognize that a healthy amount of activism, debate, vocal workforce, engaged, outspoken workforces, and especially a workforce that feels a sense of shared purpose with your organization is going to be a workforce that is more loyal, more committed, more engaged, and more likely to be advocates for you, right? And again, as a consumer, when I engage with a happy employee or employee that loves their job, I am going to be more likely to want to, become a repeat buyer of that brand. But of course, the fine line is to keep the conversation, number one, civil, right? Civil, so that we are not descending into personal attacks, but we're really talking about and debating issues. Number one, and number two, to keep it professional and focused, and ultimately remember what we're here to do. Without a successful business, we can't then bring the resources of that business to bear on.
No, absolutely. And I want to bring this to the events industry. And I don't know if you've seen some of the other sessions, but one of the things I've noticed, and I'm very proud of the events industry for, is the leadership they're taking with regard to opening up safe events. Very innovate, like a lot of innovation I'm seeing, and investment and care, right? And it's not just about the fact that it's how they're going to make money. It's the fact that, I don't know, I just feel like there's this sense of commitment to the community to do this right. So with this information that we have from you, how do you see events taking a leadership role in some of the areas here to help, positive change forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's such an opportunity for the events industry. I really do. To your point, because we've been doing this now for a year, we have learned so much. There is so much innovation, and we can take some of those best practices and thinking and not only demonstrate them in our own business as we start to bring people back together, but also share those best practices perhaps with other industries more broadly, and other places that people are gathering can learn from us, right? So I think the events industry writ large has a real opportunity for thought leadership in a broader societal sense than it ever has before, right? So that's, to me, number one. I think that events also, in a year where we're all starved for connection and human interaction, boy, this is going to be the first place. Like I'm ready to sign up for some conferences, and you can, as an events professional, really think about what are some of the new ways we can feed that sense of, we're just starved for connection. Right? How can we facilitate that? How can we bring that back to life? How can events help to restore trust by being a platform and a source for trustworthy, credible information, and for creating more of a sense of a local community, even across disparate, audiences who might be separated across different organizations and different geographies, and you still have the ability to bring us together and make it feel like a local community. And those are the things that build trust. So I'm very excited about the next year ahead.
Hi, Ralph.
Hello, I'm here. We've got some questions from the audience. And firstly, the top one is pretty much what you just talked about. So which areas of this report can significantly help the event industry? But I thought the second question was interesting as well. So it seems to be about data. What major changes are you seeing in IP policies and trends with so much online content being available? So, people protecting it, do people trust it? How are people using it? I think that's the question that one of the audience members is asking.
Yeah. So I think we've covered that first one to your point. In terms of availability of content, one of the other, big trust building attributes is transparency, right? The more transparent you are about your motives, the information that you're using to make your decision, the more people are going to trust the outcome of those decisions, right? And so I always encourage organizations to be as transparent and as open as they possibly can in terms of content. And one quick example that comes out of the report findings, I shared a data point that employer media is the most believable, most credible type of information. I'm now talking to companies who are shifting their policies so that communications that they send out to their workforce internally, they are also sharing externally in the exact, here's a memo that we just sent to our associates internally, and we want you, our customers, to see the changes we're making in internal policies and so on, right? Because what they have found is that level of transparency builds trust, number one, and that there's also a different tone that you tend to use when you're writing for your employees than if you're writing, say, a press release that's externally facing. And that tone, that sort of internal facing tone, is actually one that is more relatable and transparent for customers as well. So please tell your lawyers to let you share content, let you publish things. It's not going to get you in trouble. And I realize, of course, that there need to be some guardrails to protect assets that are, important to you and your organization. But even there, when it comes to our Trust Barometer data, our approach really is that this is something that we're doing for the industry. And if people approach us about wanting to either cite the data or use it as a foundation for additional research, we'll always happily partner with people to make sure that the data is used and available as broadly as possible.
I mean, you touch on something really interesting, and I should probably admit that I used to work in PR and internal communications. So this emotional intelligence and knowing when to speak, how to speak, and frankly, when to shut up as well. Is a skill. I mean, that's why there are professionals like you in this area. There are also some pretty famous brands who really said nothing for long periods of time. Apple springs to mind. Apple employees were not allowed to say anything for years and years and years, and it didn't really do them any harm in their industry. So being transparent, there has been, certainly 5 years ago, there's a big move towards open data, for instance, for a lot of organizations. And we've kind of come back from that with something else that you touched on in your presentation, which is really fear, disinformation, social media playing to conspiracy theories and other things. What would your advice be to event producers? Because, Heather and I actually have slightly different perspectives. I'm more international from Heather's point of view, I would think. I'm in Europe. Some of my clients, like Mobile World Congress, for instance, are desperate to come back. They've moved their event to June. It's going to be in Barcelona. I think it will happen. They're saying it's going to happen, but a lot of their sponsors have pulled out. I say a lot of their sponsors. I will be specific. Ericsson, Oracle, BT, Facebook, and a couple of others have pulled out. Now, they've used it to their advantage to kind of allow some of the new kids on the block, cloud companies in this case, to come in. So there's been some positive PR, but it's pretty clear to me that it's a bit messy. Will we have enough people vaccinated? Will we be allowed to go? So what kind of things can the event producers on this video, on this live stream at this event do to build a bit of authenticity and a bit of positive energy?
Wow.
There you go. That was my little...
Yeah, that's a great big question there for the end. Look, it's number one, things are not going to go back to normal overnight, right? We just cannot assume, okay, we're going to get to 70% vaccinated and now, boom, it can all go back to the way it was. People will continue to be fearful. And in addition, we've learned a lot of new skills and new behaviors in the last year that we don't necessarily want to keep up, that we don't necessarily want to give up. So my advice would be take it one step at a time, right? Take it slow. Think about hybrid models, right? Bring people along. Right? Don't overwhelm them with, okay, we're ready to pull the curtains back and have a big, in-person stage event. That's not necessarily what the mood will be ready for. Think about how do we create smaller, more intimate opportunities for people to gather and then still make them feel connected in a bigger, more exciting way. right? And what does that look like? Going into a room where we're spaced out and it's a room for 10,000 people and there's only 100 in it, it doesn't feel it feels a little strange, feels a little awkward, right? So let's think about everything that we've learned, all of the innovation that we've done around technology and new ways of working, and how can we continue to deploy some of those learnings even as we start to step back into perhaps a hybrid or a full in-person model.
Well, Tanya, it's been a fantastic presentation. There's so much detail. I started writing notes and then you put another slide up and I was thinking, oh, that's really interesting. I had so many questions about how you collect the data, how people respond to the questioning and, who's taking part. I thought your point about China was really interesting, which I don't think we really touched on, that perhaps as they're becoming more educated and more connected, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, really, but maybe people are becoming a bit more aware. But we've run out of time. I just want to check, are you going to be on the platform? So if people want to connect with you about
Absolutely. I'll be around and looking forward to participating in some sessions. Happy to answer any questions, and feel free to reach out to me offline as well.
Yeah, well, what a fascinating topic. I hope you'll come back and tell us what's changed, because I also feel like things keep changing every 3 months.
It's a very volatile year for sure.
Thank you, Tonya.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Heather, as well. So we're going to move on to the next session, which I'm looking forward to. It's all about neuroscience. And I'm just going to show you here, using the magic of my... Deary me, I'm a bit slow with the magic today. Here we go. So a couple of people have asked in the chat about how they find some of the content. If you're looking for things from yesterday, you can go to schedule here. You need to tick this magic box just above my head called past content, and that will reveal all of the sessions from yesterday. So for example, if you wanted to hear from Forbes, you could just click there and you can watch that session on demand. So if you're wondering about on-demand content, that's where it is. A little bit later on in the schedule, we've got some roundtables coming up, which are on the roundtables tab. So you can select one of those. It's only going to be open when the time comes up. So for me, that's 6:50 or 2:50, I believe, on the East Coast of the US. And of course, if you want to ask questions, if you're slightly confused when we refer to polling, you'll find that on the stream tab. I'll just pause that so that I don't show myself in some kind of inception tunnel. But basically, you'll find the chat on the right-hand side. You can see here, it's behind me. You can see here Fran and Ben talking. You'll also find the Q&A there as well with some of the polling. And that's also a good time to mention this feedback survey. Please tell us how you feel about the event and also each of the sessions. So that's it for this session. Next up, neuroscience.